Welcome, and very warm greetings to you all. Thank you for joining us again for another Pariyatti Presents event. My name is Briha Sarathi, and I'm here on behalf of Pariyatti as its Executive Director. We're grateful that you've all joined us today. For those of you who are not already familiar with Pariyatti, we're a non-profit charitable organization based in the USA. Our mission is to enrich the world by disseminating the words of the Buddha, providing sustenance for the seeker's journey, and illuminating the meditator's path. Pariyatti imports books from around the world, reprints books, publishes new titles, and converts existing material into digital formats. We protect and provide an enormous catalog of Dhamma resources in many languages and formats that otherwise would not be as easily available. We offer many free services, such as the Pariyatti Learning Center, Treasures of Pariyatti, and Daily Words for Inspiration via email, RSS feeds, and our mobile app. We offer most audio and video material, as well as many ebooks and audiobooks free of charge, including a large number of resources for students of SN Goenka. We also organize donation-based residential Pali workshops and facilitate pilgrimages for Vipassana meditators. For more information on Pariyatti, please do visit our website at pariyatti.org. That's PARIYATTI.org. Please note that in order to ensure a seamless experience for our audience, we've chosen to pre-record this interview with Dr. Paul Fleischman. The question and answer portion will be live, and Dr. Fleischman will be responding to questions we received during this event. So, please feel free to send your questions via the chat feature in Zoom, and send them to the user named Send Questions Here. So for those of you who are not already familiar with Dr. Fleischman, he's a retired psychiatrist, an author, and a Vipassana teacher appointed by SN Goenka, specifically for presenting Vipassana to Western audiences using scientific concepts. Dr. Fleischman obtained his MD in 1971 and trained in psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine, where he also served as a chief resident in psychiatry. He was a psychiatric consultant to numerous hospitals and clinics, and lectured at conferences, universities, and institutions throughout the Americas, Europe, and Asia. His many Pariyatti publications include Cultivating Inner Peace, Karma and Chaos, Vipassana Meditation, the Scientific Worldview, etc. Now, retired from a more than 30-year private psychiatry practice, he lives in rural New England with his wife Susan, who is also a Vipassana teacher in the tradition of SN Goenka. Dr. Fleischman's talks and articles are addressed to students looking for clarification about Vipassana's logic, utility, and psychological, biological, and spiritual effects. So today, Dr. Fleischman is interviewed by Kory Goldberg. Kory has a PhD in religious studies from the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada, and he teaches ethics, critical thinking, religion, and sustainability at Champlain College in Saint-Lambert, Quebec. He co-authored Along the Path, The Meditator's Guide to the Pilgrimage in the Buddha's Land, and is a general editor of the Pariyatti Journal, as well as a Vipassana teacher in the tradition of SN Goenka. So without further ado, I give you Paul and Kory.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of a series where we'll be exploring Paul's latest book, The Power of Small Changes, Vipassana Meditation through the Lens of Biology, Psychology, and Culture. This book is a curated collection of Paul's introductory and all student talks, university lectures, and essays delving into Vipassana meditation from the perspective of cognitive science, as well as topics concerning psychological safety in meditation and non-sectarianism. The aim of these interviews is to further examine, clarify, and deepen our understanding of the central themes laid out in The Power of Small Changes. So each session, or pair of sessions, will highlight a different section of the book. Today's discussion and the next will center on the university lectures segment. In today's event, we'll focus primarily on the psychosocial aspects of meditation, while the next one will delve into the neurobiological dimensions. So if you have any questions for Paul, please feel free to type them into the chat, but please try to keep them as specific as possible, or specific to the topic at hand, so we can maintain a clear focus throughout the conversation. So, Paul, your book offers a captivating overview of your thoughts on meditation from both the scientific and social scientific perspectives. What inspired you to write this book? And more broadly, what led you to become a public speaker on meditation?
About 40 years ago, I wrote some essays called Why I Sit and the Therapeutic Action of Vipassana Meditation and similar essays based upon Goenkaji's exhortation that people who could speak or write about Vipassana do so to let the world know that Vipassana was now available. At that point in time, it was not very available. Most people had never heard the word. After reviewing the things I'd written, Goenkaji encouraged me to take up this role of speaking to audiences in the West and to professional and academic audiences. In those days, Goenkaji imagined that the West was a different place than the East. Today, that seems quite archaic since we have people of every kind living in every country. So our mandate now has shifted to talking to academic and professional audiences wherever they may be. For a long time, Goenkaji would review things I'd written, and after a while, he just let me run free. So these are the talks in The Power of Small Changes are mostly subsequent to 2015. They come after previous books of previous talks. And this group is more aimed at a typically American academic audience, or in the case of other chapters that we'll be discussing later, it's aimed at old students right here in the United States, but many of their issues will also be relevant to old students everywhere in the world. Then some of the topics in the book came up because of discussions in the Western world about them, such as what non-sectarian means, or such as what the safety of meditation entails. And those are topics we'll take up later, Kory. So
Great, thank you. Thank you for providing that context. Um, so there's a lot of confusion surrounding the concept of ego in Western interpretations of Buddhist thought. Can you clarify the distinction between the psychoanalytic concept of ego and the Buddhist concept of anatta, and explain how Vipassana addresses both these ideas?
So one of the big issues that comes up all the time is the issue of translation. Most of us, myself included, learn Vipassana in English, but Vipassana was originally spoken about in Pali or recorded in the Pali Canon, and then other languages like Hindi are closer to the Pali and easier to make a bridge walking from the ancient Pali language to modern concepts. But in English, we had to make a huge jump, and some of the original translations were made by people who either didn't know Pali well or who knew Pali well but didn't know anything about meditation. The translators were linguists and not meditators. So we've arrived at a place where lots of words have become standardized in the discussion of meditation, vipassana, etc., and they're not necessarily correct. One of those words is the word ego. Ego is not really a traditional English word at all. It didn't appear in the English language till around the beginning of the 20th century, or late in the 19th century. And the word ego first appeared in English writing when it was used by translators of Sigmund Freud, who wrote in a Viennese dialect of German, and the translators translated him into British English. And they invented the word ego to stand for what Freud was calling the word self. What a mess. The
Mm-hmm.
word ego doesn't really translate into anything that we grow up speaking about when we're using even British English today or American English. And unfortunately, to compound the problem, when translations of Pali began to appear, the word self got turned into the neologism of ego in English. So the origin of the word ego comes from translating psychoanalysis, a German-based conceptual psychotherapy, and it's gotten applied to an ancient tradition that long predates the word ego and has nothing to do with the word ego. And so there's two entirely different meanings to the word ego, and neither of them are particularly relevant to what we're trying to talk about. So in psychoanalysis, the word ego was introduced to refer to those aspects of our personality that are closely aligned with more American English terms like competence, focus, awareness, organization, intellectual, emotional, personal capacities of high function. That's what ego meant in the psychoanalytic tradition. That's very different than the way the word ego has been applied when it's inappropriately but nevertheless consistently used to translate concepts from Pali, where the word ego is used by translators to refer to arrogance, self-importance, over-assessment of oneself, clinging to oneself, self-referential adoration. So you can see the two are not only different, they're almost the opposite. In the teaching of the Buddha, it's important to be competent, to be alert, to be focused, to be able to direct one's volition into one's thoughts and actions. In fact, you could say that's the heart of the teaching. But to be able to do that, one has to have a strong ability to do those things. And in psychoanalysis, that's called having a healthy, strong ego. But that sounds like you're saying that people should have a big inflated sense of self, which is obviously the opposite of the Buddha's teaching. So the terms have led to the confusion of people being fakely modest, not acknowledging how well organized or capable they are. And it's also led to people thinking that they shouldn't be capable. Somehow people begin to imagine that the teaching of the Buddha is to be inept, unfocused, incapable of directing one's volition to lead one's life. And obviously that's completely not true. So unfortunately, there's two meanings to the word. Neither are the best choice of words. It takes a few words to capture some of these terms.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, it's really intriguing how the term ego is misused not only in a Dhamma context, but is also misused in the English language. Good. So, right speech is an essential component of the Noble Eightfold Path. The Pali texts usually describe it as the opposite of wrong speech, that is, speech that's false, divisive, harsh, meaningless. But you describe right speech in positive terms, writing that, in your words, involves honesty, skillful timing and phrasing, and courtesy. Can you explain some of the principles of right speech and provide examples of how it can be cultivated through Vipassana practice?
So I like the idea of right speech very much. To me, the other Shila, once one becomes an established meditator, accepts the fact that Shila is to be integrated into one's life all day, every day, most of that does not become a consistent challenge. For example, I'm not trying every day to refrain from killing other people. It doesn't come up in my life very often. So the idea of saying I'm not going to kill, well, that's a very good position to take in life, but it doesn't challenge me every day. Right speech, on the other hand, is a challenge, I could say, every hour, in some cases every minute. Right speech is a challenge all day, every day. It's never finished. One never completes it. There's a new interaction, a new person, a new situation, which requires one to say things that are right and true, but which may be in contexts in which the sense of right and true becomes very complicated. The concept right speech, as you know well, Kory, is repeated very often in the Pali Canon. Obviously, the Buddha put a great deal of stress on this, but the repetitions are not always the same. Sometimes they're slightly different. So if you read different definitions of right speech, you will find or not find one or another English term appended to the concept of right speech. So I take right speech in the following way. Everything in the Dhamma has a sort of a central core. It's like our Dhamma wheel, the wheel at the center of our practice. And that is cultivating equanimity with awareness of sensations, reaching the understanding of the impermanence of ourself and everything else, and trying to live a life of peace with ourselves and peace with other people. And so right speech is speech that promotes the essence of Dhamma. That is to say, right speech is speech that moves you positively along the path towards positivity and away from negativity. And sometimes that's very difficult to come up with. For example, in a conflict, how do you address the person you're disagreeing with? How forceful should you be? Should you be concerned with disabusing them of what you think is their wrong view? Should you be concerned with being polite and therefore possibly agreeing with things that you don't necessarily really agree with? If you're withholding the strength of your speech, are you undercutting the importance of something you believe in? But if you say something with full conviction, are you merely stimulating an argument and moving in a direction away from right speech? This comes up in family life, but it also comes up in professional lives. It came up in my professional life many, many times every day. How do you speak to people and say things that they may not want to hear, but that it's your job to say? As a professor, you must have that, or as a psychiatrist, I had that. And so I find right speech is the single great daily challenge in life, is to how to address other people in a manner that does not harm others, but does not harm oneself, that does help others and does help oneself. And sometimes it can't be found. And there's a challenge right there. And sometimes when it can be found, it's still difficult to deliver. So the example I've used in some of these essays is, for example, if you're a doctor, as I was, and you've discovered a patient has a very severe illness. If you just walk up to them and say, well, I found out that you're a dead duck, that's not a very skillful medical intervention. But if you say to them, don't worry, it's all going to pass, you're going to be fine, that's not very skillful. How do you manage to say the hard things in life? And once you've said them, have you done a good job? Do they need a revision? Do they need some feedback between you and the person you're speaking with so they can comment back to you on the quality of your right speech? So I find it a many times a day challenge and extremely interesting. And it takes the Buddha out of a kind of ancient historical phrasing of one static thing called right speech and moves the Buddha's path into a living, dynamic, problem-solving way of living.
Mhm. For me, I find that empathy, the more skilled I am at cultivating empathy, the easier time I have with practicing right speech because it allows me to take a step back and understand what the person is trying to say, even if I don't agree. So if I'm with a student, for example, recently I had a student who was complaining, not very happy about the grade she received. And part of me just wants to, fluff her off. It's the end of the semester. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I want to get on with things. And on the other hand, I recognize here's this, suffering student in front of me. So I need to patiently listen I've been exactly where she is, so I can recognize the emotions that she's feeling and expressing. And once there's that level of empathy cultivated, I'm in a it just becomes much easier to speak with her um, in ways that are not harsh and disagreeable. So, what in, what importance would you give to the um, conscious cultivation of empathy as sort of a foundation for right speech?
Yeah, that's a wonderful comment because empathy is not a word you'll find in any English translation of the Pali or of other classical Buddhist works or works about Vipassana. Empathy is a kind of um, grandfathered into the concept of compassion. And they're similar, but they're not the same. Compassion means to feel for that person's plight, to not condemn them or not dismiss them, but to hold their plight in your heart and to share feelings with them about the difficulty of their circumstance. But that is not empathy, which is to feel what the person is feeling, or to feel what you intuit the person is feeling, or to feel what the person says they are feeling. That is, to align not your sympathies with the person, but your feelings with the person. And so, of course, empathy is, in the modern world is considered one of the higher psychological developments. I avoid that term in right speech simply because it's not in the Pali Canon, but I agree with what you said 100%. Of course, it doesn't take away all the difficulty. You can empathize with someone, and then they can still not like at all what you have to say.
Well said. Okay, I'd like to read a quote from your essay, Our Best and Most Lasting Gift, a more thorough explanation of how meditation works. So you write, through meditation, we can improve our self-soothing skills. It can help us restore the peace inside our mind and body, and thereby can paradoxically also permit wider adaptive strategizing, allowing us to wander further away from calm because we will remain elastically tethered by our improved skill at restoration of peace. So, when I read this, I understand that you're suggesting that meditation has the potential to foster resilience and adaptive capacity in the face of uncertainty and especially adversity. Can you elaborate on how meditation can cultivate these qualities and provide examples of how this might manifest in daily life?
Good question. Thank you. So, um, I think that's a very important point because um, sometimes, in fact, frequently, meditation is interpreted as always avoiding situations that may stir strong, difficult emotions. And an interpretation of meditation like that leads to a lifestyle of avoidance or may tempt a person towards a lifestyle of avoidance of conflict, which becomes a smaller and smaller zone in which people become more and more hindered from engaging all the difficulties that everyone has to face as they pass through life. So it would be ideal, if it were true, that meditation enables a person to face more difficulties and yet return themselves to the equanimity, which is in fact the goal of the meditative life. I can't say that's always true, but I can say I've seen that very true many times. And the place I would look for it that is interesting to comment on, I mean, it would be true probably in every person's life all the time. A meditator will face interpersonal difficulties in their close relationships. They'll face difficulties in their profession or job. They'll face difficulties as citizens. And all these difficulties may draw us away from equanimity to which we want to return. But one place that we all share, something quite common, is when we're serving in Dhamma. The more people serve in Dhamma, the more they face difficulties. Dhamma service is not easy. If you know people who serve frequently and intensely, you find out they face many difficulties. This would be true if someone's working in the kitchen during a 10-day course. This would be true if someone is involved in doing registration at a center. This would be true if someone is conducting a course or if someone is the center teacher. In all those cases, I've watched dozens of my friends in Vipassana deal with many difficult, troubling, problematic circumstances. And these people being people who are committed to the Dhamma life, who pursue the Dhamma life in spite of its difficulties, we find these people facing increasing circumstances of difficulty, shouldering increasing circumstances of difficulty as they opt for more and more engagement with larger numbers of students, again, whether they're working in a kitchen, conducting a course, serving a course. And they voluntarily, these Dhamma servants, voluntarily shoulder problems in order to serve the Dhamma. But their goal is not to be shaken. Their goal is not to get lost in negativities, upset, despair, anguish. Their goal is to restore themselves to equanimity. And so we can say it's somewhat like children and their parents. When you have a little child, the child is afraid to leave its mother's knee. When it's 18 months old, it clings to the mother's knee. But by the time a child is 3 or 4, you hope this child is running around the room, not clinging to their mother. The more security the child has, the more he or she will be able to wander free of their mother's skirts. And so that analogy could pertain to the way we cultivate equanimity in the real world in an engaged life as a meditator. The more you feel confident that when you go back home in the evening, you'll be able to sit down, meditate, and restore some degree of equanimity, the more you feel confident to engage difficulties, knowing they won't throw you off. So the deeper your ability to recontact equanimity, the more confidence you can face equanimity-shaking circumstances.
Well said. Thank you. So we're at a time where there's a lot of upheaval and our equanimity is tested. And we often feel pressured to develop and display opinions, even about things we don't understand, or when we lack justification or we lack adequate evidence. This happens in the realm of politics and religion and business and health, interpersonal relationships, as you had mentioned, you name it. And the Buddha taught that right view, the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, was actually going beyond views, transcending them, which I think is fair to extend to say beyond opinions. Opinions, especially those that are misinformed or misguided, often serve as the foundation for unwarranted overconfidence. And this overconfidence often leads to self-righteousness, which in turn leads to further tension and conflict. So can you please talk about the troubles that we have with opinions and overconfidence and their potential impacts on individuals, society, and even the environment today?
We can say that human life is a theater of opinions, self-righteousness, and conflict. To some large extent, we can define the human situation as groups of people cohering and establishing relatively stable situations, whether they're countries or tribes or regions or states, where people more or less agree on how they're going to behave. They more or less agree on what the truth is, and they cohere into an organized unit that's not constantly at odds with itself by believing in what they believe in and following what they believe in. The difficulty is that there are so many different groups, tribes, nations, states, religions, belief systems, that each one is in conflict with the others. And this is what makes the human condition so fractious. And in a modern world, even those baseline assumptions as to what's true and what we believe in and what practices we follow, even those become fractious as people develop their own sources of information, their own in-groups, their own tribes, their own belief systems, their own politics and religion. A couple of comments on this. Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize in psychology, but he won a Nobel Prize in economics. Daniel Kahneman, still alive, one of the great psychologists of all time, said that the greatest discovery of 20th century Western psychology was the discovery that almost all human beings, almost all the time, are overconfident, meaning people believe that what they believe is true. They're confident it's true. And they're confident it's true even though people 100 miles away recognize perfectly well that that truth is not truth. Even though we recognize that 100 years ago, people believed in things we know today are wrong. And we can be sure 100 years from now, people will understand certain principles of nature or the cosmos or even human relationships that we don't understand today, yet we're convinced most of the time that what we know is true. And there are humorous effects of this on studies of how, if you ask people how they drive, almost everybody thinks they're above average. It's statistically impossible for everybody to be above average, but most people think they're above average drivers. So this overconfidence is actually what the headlines of every newspaper is about. It's actually about what every war is about. It's actually about what every strong social conflict is about, is people convinced they are correct and other people are wrong. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it telling? Isn't it relieving that 2,500 years ago, the Buddha understood this and made that the first step. The first step is recognizing that what you believe may not be correct. Overconfidence would be a good translation of that elusive term we were discussing earlier, ego, that is arrogance, self-importance, loving oneself above everything else. And so the Buddha starts his path with asking us to recognize the importance of examining how we know what we know, why we think we know it, and letting go of those things that it becomes clear we don't actually know.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there is a danger on the other side that people, overly diligent, naive interpreters of the Buddhist path, may affect the idea that they don't believe in anything at all. And to that, I use examples like if someone says, what country is Buenos Aires located? And you say, I think it's in Germany. That's not overcoming overconfidence. That's just a foolish, false modesty that claims you know nothing. We know many things. We do know many things.
And so just in relation to that, might we be overconfident that the observation of sensations is the only way or the best way to cultivate a peaceful and free mind or an awakened mind?
Yes. I think one of the real charms of Vipassana, one of the things I like most about it is when I meditate, and I think this is true for most people when they meditate, there's some problem on your mind. you're trying to work with sensations, be aware of them. At the same time, your mind is darting off to solve this problem that you don't want to be solving. You want to be meditating, but nevertheless, your mind is not fully under your control, and you wander off to solve this problem in your mind. And you come up with a great solution. And then the next time you're meditating, you come up with a rather different conclusion. And then the next time, it's quite different. And then the next time, you're so relieved that you didn't go with the conclusion that you thought you had arrived the first time. So meditation gives you this panya, this perspective, this seeing things from multiple perspectives. And there's nothing more healing of this tendency to over-belief, overconfidence, self-importance, cocksuredness. There's nothing better than meditation to make you recognize that your ideas change all the time. What you think you know changes. What you think you believe in changes. And if you're so lucky as to meditate for many years of a lifetime, you see massive changes in what you take to be true. And they're not the same things that you thought were true when you started meditating. So meditation is a premier tool aimed at this human flaw, aimed by the Buddha's insight into this human flaw. But it's not the only way for a person to become open-minded, broad-minded, empathic towards other worldviews, curious about other worldviews, recognizing one's faults, ability to make changes in one's ideology. There are many ways to do that, and they include, for example, a liberal education that leads you to look at the history of cultures and see how beliefs and ideas change over time. To have many friends who disagree with you and who lead you to re-examine your ideas or emotions or thoughts. So there are many ways to arrive at this, but the Buddha takes it the farthest, I believe. He takes it the farthest to viewpoints are to be suspect. We should transcend the creation of self-important thinking moment by moment and try to direct our thinking towards what we can be confident we have arrived at through careful self-assessment.
Great, thank you. Well said. Although you don't directly address the concept of spiritual bypassing in The Power of Small Changes, you do seem to touch upon it without using the actual term. Can you talk to this idea of using meditation as a substitute for dealing with one's personal problems? How do we see meditators fall into this trap? What are the dangers of falling into this trap? And what are the ways out when we do find ourselves in this trap?
So the word spiritual bypass was introduced in the recent decades to refer to people who use any part of anybody's spiritual life to bypass problem solving and to take comfort in the fantasies that spiritual life sometimes generates without actually solving the problems that are being substituted for fantasy solutions. That problem isn't, I don't use the word spiritual bypass because human beings bypass problem solving in many ways. And that seduction of going beyond a problem and saying we think we've got it solved because we have a fantasy solution to it, that occurs not only in spiritual life, it occurs in political life, domestic life, economic life, etc. So it's a common human form of, let's say, less than effective problem solving. But it does happen to meditators, as it happens to all people. And one of the ways it comes up in meditation is particularly focused upon Western society. In the ancient traditions that we read about, which are our historical founding myth, the era of the Buddha, the era of the Buddha's teaching, and the people who followed the Buddha, we hear very little about people problem solving as they become meditators. The stereotyped characters in the Pali Canon are the Buddha himself, who has no job and no family, his close followers, Sariputta, Moggallana, who have no job and no family, and the bhikkhus who tend to have no names, and who have no job and no family. So all of these people are described as meditators, but they're not described in circumstances that require them to figure out how they're going to earn a living, who they're going to vote for, what school they're going to send their children to, or the problems that Western meditators today tend to deal with. So a danger for a modern Western meditator is to think that meditation will be a way out of facing circumstances that are a little frightening, a little overwhelming, a little scary, a little confusing, that we wish we could avoid. And meditation may sometimes lead a person to feel, I'll just keep meditating, I'll not focus on that problem, and somehow it will get solved, which is called passive fantasy. Instead of actively solving, I passively fantasize this problem will go away. And by God, sometimes problems do just go away. And that reinforces our passive fantasy. And so this danger, the so-called spiritual bypass, I would say passive fantasy solutions, pseudo-solutions to life problems, is something that meditators can be attuned to. I think that in the people who tend to be in notable positions in our tradition, we don't find that at all. We find people who are excellent problem solvers. In fact, it's their problem solving abilities that enable them to both meditate and solve the practical problems of life so that they can do both. And so I think we have many good exemplars of that fusion, that union of these two potentials. But still, the drift is there, and it's something that meditation communities can look for. For example, sometimes people devote so much time and energy to sitting and serving that they may not be attending to other needs they have, such as family life, economic life, health care, personal health care, etc.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, that nicely leads to the next question I wanted to bring up with you is around engagement with life. So in your essay, Meditation for Adaptive Resilience, you emphasize that the Buddha was a socially engaged teacher, and you go on to state in your words, while meditation focuses on disengaging from body sensations and reactions to them, it should not lead to withdrawing from social responsibility and concern. So this orientation does not align with the common perceptions of the Buddha as a withdrawn recluse. Would you like to address that?
Sure. Right there, as you're talking, Kory, the thing that rings up in my heart is, well, thank God for Goenkaji. I had actually studied Buddhism before I met Goenkaji, and it seemed to give off, in my misreading, it seemed to give off the flavor of an ancient monk from 1,000 years ago, just sitting there and having no problems whatsoever. It didn't really seem to offer much to me, a person who experienced himself as having a lot of problems to solve, some of which at the time seemed improbable, unsolvable. We're going back, say, 40 plus, 50 plus years. And then from the opening of his 10-day discourses, the first course Susan and I took together in India in 1974, I realized Goenkaji was teaching something entirely different. He had a very, very strong focus on competency, responsibility, and care for other people. Care for other people, meaning your family, or if you're in the Dhamma organization, if you're helping spread Vipassana in the world, care for other people by helping them find their way to and practice Vipassana. And this very forceful focus of Goenkaji's world, when you become a meditator in this tradition and you start participating in this world, you find the number one focus is serving other people. That's so different than the image of the Buddha sitting under a tree, all alone, meditating, with a deva and a tree and never doing anything to help anybody else. So Goenkaji really refocused my attention, and I would say all of our attention, on the fact that the Buddha was being misrepresented or easily misread by us Westerners, and that from the very beginning of the emergence of the Buddha's teaching, there was this focus on helping other people find this path. And then you read about the Buddha spending his whole life going from place to place to place to place, never stopping walking except in the rainy season, always concerned with bringing his teaching to other people. And even the famous passages at the end of his life, where as he's dying, he's still doing his best that he can to bring his teaching to other people. That's the spirit of our tradition, and it's a revelation and a great help. And it helped me personally overcome the resistance I had, as if the Buddha's teaching was, as I had incorrectly imagined it to be, a very selfish, narcissistic, self-absorbed way of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recently met somebody who was a monk in beginning in the 60s, and when he was practicing for the first couple of years, he was living this life as a withdrawn recluse and just studying in his monastery and not being very engaged with the world. And then he did a course with Goenkaji, and that opened up his eyes to the potential of a lay Dhamma culture, and he was very grateful for that. He didn't stay within the tradition. He went on and explored many other things, but it was interesting. He was fortunate to have met somebody like Goenkaji, a lay person. And it's ironic that on the one hand, Goenkaji is focuses so much on engaging with life, engaging with the world. People who practice deeply in his tradition are often have a very serious sitting practice where they spend periods of their lives deep in meditation, and it just shows that they're not mutually exclusive, they're mutually supporting. And uh, it's that deep sitting practice that really allows us to be fully engaged in the world. Um, Not to say that there aren't other traditions who do that as well, but it's just one thing I've noticed with our tradition. Um, okay, you refer to the practice of metta as the great embrace. What do you mean by that?
So one of the things we just started discussing, as soon as we opened the topic of this book and what these talks were about and how I gave them and how Goenkaji encouraged me to give them, etc., first thing we come up with is problems of language, where it's not just finding a word that's an exact representation of a word in another language, but frequently there are no words that are parallel between the two languages. And so you need a bunch of words or a paragraph or a complex sentence with meanings going in different directions. And that leads to some inaccurate interpretations, some inaccurate translations. So the word metta is one of those words. Metta is not something that I have been able to find any English language word for. It's often interpreted as loving kindness. I don't really know what that means. It's kind of a white bread sort of term. It doesn't help me at all. I do hope I know what metta means, having practiced it for 40 to 50 years, and Goenkaji giving an explanation, and then me trying to practice it, and year after year after year, hopefully improving in this practice. But I still didn't have a good word for it. So when a person is giving a talk about Vipassana or writing a chapter about Vipassana, there's either one is stuck with the word metta, which to the normal English speaker has no meaning whatsoever, or one can say loving kindness, which I find watered down and inaccurate expression of what we're actually practicing. And so I just hunted around for what would be my way of phrasing this if there were no other term, there was no loving kindness to use, And I didn't want to use a word from Pali, which has no resonance at all with English speakers. And I came up with the word, the great embrace. I use that phrase. It's obviously made up and not necessarily to everybody's liking. I use that phrase because metta is not just loving kindness. It's something great. It's something big. In Goenkaji's emphasis to us, it's one of the critical measures of how you're progressing on the path, is how you're developing metta. So it's not just a feeble kindness. It's something great. It's something that expands your life. It's like a balloon that's expanding. And embrace, that's different than mere kindness. It's a welcoming or a, a fondness or a commitment to, like embracing someone who's walked into your house. So that's what the way I came up with a alternative English language phrase for metta.
Hmm. So this great embrace, we could say that this is one thing that really holds the Vipassana community together. Can you talk about how it complements the practice of Vipassana and how it might manifest in the centers?
Well, I think that the absence of metta, if there were a Vipassana practice without metta, I don't think it would exist. I think it would fall apart and scatter away like leaves in autumn. Because to form a community, we can form a community around a common practice when we're practicing it together, like at a meditation course, but then you scatter and leave. People don't live at our centers. You can have a belief system in common, and then you're falling prey to Daniel Kahneman's critique of human beings bonded together by false beliefs that they share and that make them a tribe or a group, bonded by belief, not by actual feeling. So metta is a feeling tone that connects meditators to each other. It connects meditators to non-meditators. It connects meditators to dogs and cats and people suffering in war zones and people they've never met and people who died 1,000 years ago and people who haven't been born. But it also connects meditators to meditators. And the feeling that you know that that other person is practicing metta and that you are practicing metta is something that gives you relatively higher confidence that you're going to be able to work things out with this person when you're dealing with a meal that's about to be served 10 minutes late at on a 10-day course when everything is timed so perfectly, or a difference of opinion about whether a certain student should be allowed to take a course or not, or whatever uh, discussion comes up in our Vipassana community. The wish, which is probably true a great deal of the time, that we're held together by the knowledge that we all try to practice metta is a point of contact between us that's deeper than belief. It's even deeper than practice. It's an emotional bond.
Hmm. Thank you. So before I let you go, I have just one last question. Maybe it's the most challenging one. Um, so impermanence is a central tenet of the Buddha's teaching. Meditation with the basis of impermanence connects us to the ever-changing nature of our bodies at the atomic level. How does recognizing the impermanence of all things, including our physical selves, contribute to a sense of peace, liberation, and this great embrace? How can we integrate this understanding into our daily lives?
It is one of the great questions, if not the great question. I remember, this goes back many years, but describing to someone who I knew moderately well. They didn't know me that well. And so, oh, you meditate? What is meditation? Why do you do it? And I was saying, well, you learn about impermanence and the impermanence of yourself. And this person said, what, you're working so hard to just find out you're going to pass away and die, and that's all you get out of this meditation? So impermanence is not necessarily what many people think about when they think about bonding themselves to something like peace or well-being or a good life. Very often, peace or well-being or a good life is associated with something like, I will fly in the sky, I'll be happy every single second for eternity, which means trillions of years and trillions of more years and trillions of more years. And every second of that, I will be totally happy. And uh, that's a tall order. Now, the Buddhist teaching is radical. It does change us away from some of our hopes and dreams that are shared by almost all children almost everywhere in the world, which is for a permanent, unchanging, guaranteed, absolute happiness built upon the shoulders of some big, strong other being who will make us safe and secure and make us happy forever. But since those things don't exist, impermanence is reality. So I think the secret of the Buddha's path is three topics, three things. He said, I don't consider myself a Buddhist. I don't consider myself a Buddhist fundamentalist, but I do consider myself a student of the Buddha whose teaching revolutionized the human condition. And the three things that he teaches are everything that is made out of matter is composed of things that will dissolve, and everything made of matter will disappear. In the modern language, we say the entropic universe, the universe made out of entropy. Every planet will disappear, every star will disappear, every galaxy will disappear. Of course, every person will disappear. Then the second feature of the Buddhist teaching is this does not happen by caprice. This process of creation, dissolution, the star is created, the solar system is created, they exist for millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of years, but then they disappear. A human is created, he or she lives 100 years at most, disappears. This all happens lawfully, so we can understand it. It's not merely terrifying caprice. It is an organized, meaningful unity of the world built around something called Dhamma, the laws of the universe. And then the third feature of the Buddhist teaching, the universe is entropic, it's always changing, dissolving, it's lawful. And the third is there is a path, a way to interpret the lawfulness of the universe and its changing impermanent nature. And that path is built upon learning to interpret that universe by observing it as it operates in your own mind and body. And that's why we focus on the impermanence of our body sensations, in which we directly experience the most important law of the universe. So instead of being made happy riding the shoulders of some great invisible non-existent being, the goal of our pathway is to understand impermanence and how it directs us to live life in a way that is maximally compatible with the truth of the universe. So it's a path of truth-seeking and well-being based upon truth-seeking. And that's based upon the reality of impermanence.
Great, thank you. So is there any points you'd like to add on this subject before we go to the audience questions?
Sure. Impermanence is very hard to stick with because all of us have the fantasy, I have the fantasy, that tomorrow I will be happy all day without any wavering or flickering of any unhappiness in my mind. And I want that, and I crave that. And I don't like and I don't want anything that is unpleasant. And so working with impermanence is a task that requires constantly re-dipping into the reality of it. And that makes the path of meditation very gratifying and very difficult.
Mhm. Thanks. That's great. So thank you, Paul. So now we will begin taking questions from the audience. So the first question we have here is social interaction is increasingly digital and fast-paced. Are there dangers to this? If so, how can Vipassana help?
Sure. Um, it's hard to think of anything more present in everybody's life today, yesterday, tomorrow than our digital, fast-paced, dangerous, verbal universe that's sprung up and keeps getting more and more intrusive and expansive due to the internet and its subsequent forms like AI. I do think that the wise person today, meditator or not, has to consider the impact of their digital conversations or presence or absence of presence and its impact upon them. But looking at it from the standpoint of Vipassana, there's a few things that stand out about our digital conversations. First thing is, it's wonderful. We can connect with people far away in other time zones and other continents. We can have whole lifelong relationships with people who are too far away for us to actually meet and connect with. So we don't want to reject it or blame it for uh, every problem in the world and lose the opportunity that the modern world has provided us to be increasingly humanly connected to many other people. But the speed is definitely a problem. One of the things I was talking about earlier in today's conversations, first topic was right speech. It's very hard to come upon right speech in a thoughtless manner. Maybe you could say the definition of right speech is thoughtful communication. Thoughtful about your own motives, about your own knowledge, and what you want to say and how you want to say it. So a certain spaciousness, a certain relaxation, a certain pace is a critical part of high level communication that brings gratification to both parties. And the speed and the haste of our modern communication systems are definitely not aligned with the best practices of a Vipassana meditator on the path. Another issue is scattering of our attention. How many conversations do we participate in? Which ones are really valuable? How much time do we give to each one? So we need to assert some thoughtful control over how much, when, and with whom we engage. And then some conversations on the internet are places where we don't belong. It's not to condemn them or judge them. It's just to uh, notice that we can have no genuine communication in that framework. The framework is set up in such a way, it's so rancorous, it's so closed, it's so driven towards its own belief system, its own conclusion, it's so tribal, it's so overdetermined, it's so overconfident. There's no role or room for us to partake in it. And those are spaces that we should exit from. So managing our communication systems today still requires the basic insights of right speech and is quite a challenge.
Thank you, Paul. Personally, I find slowing down is really important. Um, if I'm in a tense conversation via text or email, I need to sometimes give myself at least overnight or 24 hours before pressing the send button to incorporate that level of slowness.
Yeah, I use that same technique. I write something and don't send it, and then send it after some pause, an hour
Mm.
or a day.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question we have here. Doesn't refraining from killing actually come up frequently in daily life with respect to dietary decisions, such as eating meat and fish? So it seems this is more of a comment than a question. Do you have any response to that?
It seems to be uh, asking me to go a little further with the comments I made about right speech being something that happens to us every day, but not killing is not something I participate in every day. One of the differences between those two is that people tend to develop a dietary pattern. People are not making every hour of their working life, they're not making a dietary decision. Every day of their life, they're not making a dietary decision. People usually come down upon one practice or another and follow it either for a lifetime or in any case for a period of years. So there is a big decision there about what leads to a diet that's compatible with the path you are following, but it's not revised so often. That said, there's still a decision for sure. For example, the difference between vegetarianism and veganism. In Goenkaji's guidance to us, the idea is you can't keep revising everything you do. There are many changes in your life that will be imposed upon you, and you need the flexible, adaptive, responsive capacity to respond to many changes. But some things can be relatively stabilized, relatively set. Our centers, for example, follow certain ways of life and can't be revised by all the hundreds of thousands of participants, each one of whom will have a suggestion of how our center can be improved. We can't possibly respond to all those suggestions. Many of the suggestions are contrary to each other. We can't satisfy every person. So our centers are built upon certain principles and follow those principles, but people are free to change those. And certainly considering your diet is definitely a very important part of following the path of not killing.
Um, so the next question here is, what is your advice for discussing emotionally charged topics like politics with friends and family members who are very attached to their views?
That question has never been harder, never been more challenging, and never been more present. And that does seem to be a product of the internet. We are in touch with so many people, and so many people we're in touch with are in touch with so many other people, so many opinions, and so much self-confident, self-righteous belligerent. So one good thing to think about is what is the relationship that you have with that person? Is it trusting and safe enough, or will it only lead to an impersonal, fractious engagement? I don't see any point in that. On the other hand, if there's some trust, even if it brings up a certain amount of discomfort in yourself or in the other person, the conversation may be worth engaging in. Another thing is, what is your magnitude, capacity, responsibility in that circumstance? For example, I had a very good friend from my college years who was a very committed hunter. And when I was new to Vipassana, I took it upon myself to convince him that he was making a mistake. So I became ideological, intrusive, self-righteous, and uh, sort of a convert seeker. One of my good friends, Elder and Dhamma, more practiced than I at that point, said to me, "Do you think you're really going to be able to make any headway in this conversation? Will it have some value? Will you help yourself or this other person? Or are you generating an argument that you yourself are the generator of? And out of thinking you've got some right answer to the world, like not killing animals, you're creating one more argument in the world." So that's a good question we should all be asking. What will the actual outcome of my conversation with this person likely be?
Did you maintain that friendship?
Yes,
Yeah.
I stopped being so ideological, and I had to tolerate values that I wasn't personally comfortable with. And so did my friend have to do that with someone like me who meditates twice a day. Very strange.
I'm in the same position.
Oh, okay.
And that's it. The more we insist that our view is correct, it just weakens the friendship. And we just don't know. Um, because I do know people who hunt who are actually very loving, socially engaged, wonderful people, and do have a lot of respect for the animals that they are about to kill and consume over a long period of time. And I know lots of very angry vegans, and vegetarians who spew lots of negativity and violence through their words and attitudes. So it's hard to make blanket statements, which is why I appreciate that the five precepts are guidelines and not laws. Okay, the next question we have here, it's also following this line of questioning around views. It says, can a meditator believe in a creator God and succeed along the path of scientifically informed Vipassana meditation?
The answer is yes, but there's a couple of factors to consider there. Goenkaji opened the doors to all of us, and that means opening the doors to people with many different beliefs, including all the various theological religions. And many people come to Vipassana with those beliefs in their heart. And lots of times Goenkaji's discourses teasingly portray the common images of the deity and show their self-flattering and superficial nature. But many participants in Vipassana have much more deep-seated, rich, well thought out, heartfelt feelings about their deities, and they're not the comic book forms of deities, and these images may be powerful and important to those people. In Vipassana, the general guideline you find the Buddha giving over and over in his discourses is, will your, and then what's the next thing? Will your practice, will your way of life, will your diet, will your relationships move you along on the path of loving kindness, absence of dogma, freedom from fear, freedom from hate? Or will your beliefs, your practices, your attitudes, will they move you further along path of self-importance, solution, argument, and unhappiness? So a pragmatic measure can be placed against how we're walking the path. If a person feels where I am now in my life on the path, this belief that I have is very important to me. I can't and don't want to surrender it. And there's no reason they should surrender it. If on the path, years later, their circumstances change, their Vipassana practice change, the world they live in changes, they may choose to reevaluate that. It is true that in the long, lifelong pathway that the Buddha's teaching lays out in front of us, holding to a concept of self, a person-like thing in the universe, is not the teaching of the Buddha. But for most of us walking the path, there are many, many things that we don't attain in this lifetime. Our path is not the belief that within one lifetime, everybody attains everything. We're not that facile, naive, or untutored about who we really are in our hearts and minds. So there's a bifurcation there. The person who's benefiting on the Dhamma path doesn't need to shed what helps them benefit. The long-term view of the Buddha is there is no self in us or in the universe. If you've gotten to the place where adhering to that is essential, congratulations, you've gotten to a far place. And if you haven't gotten to that place, you don't need to do surgery on your emotions and thoughts just to please a book.
Can Vipassana support social or political activism?
This is the biggest question that comes up every conversation now. Now means in recent years. Vipassana supports deep individual thinking, feeling, and relating, and focusing those deep reflections that come up in the life of the meditator onto a way of life that leads to harmony, peace, well-being in oneself and others. If a person finds that as they're living the Dhamma life, they feel called to social action, it seems very compatible, doesn't it? It means that person is not going to sit in their hut, sit in their cell, sit in their private comfort. They're going to launch themselves out into the tumult of the world with the hope, the aim, the goal of increasing harmony and well-being among other people. And as we discussed earlier, sometimes the skillful adult needs to walk through certain levels of disharmony in order to get to deeper levels of harmony. Example being a constructive conversation between two relatively harmonious people but who currently disagree. And the conversation may stir up disharmony, unease, yet lead to something further down the road that's more compatible with the life of equanimity. So the measure is, what will the impact be upon you and the world by launching into this social action? Very often, the result is very positive. A person feels more useful. They feel they can bring their Dhamma depth of what they're cultivating in themselves through meditation. They can bring that out to others in the world and make it live, give it more momentum. Unfortunately, the political arena is extremely fraught. It eventually moves towards war. War is always the intergroup method of solving problems. It still is. It has always been. It was in the time of the Buddha when there were wars. There were wars during and after the Buddha's life that swept around him. So our position is not unique. And if a person finds that their social engagements are leading them further into a path where they cannot place into that life their own Dhamma values, practices, and volitions, but on the contrary, they're being swept off of their chosen way of being into a more chaotic, violent, unsympathetic, callous, cruel way of being. That's not the right path to be on for a Vipassana meditator.
Thank you. So this person asks, related to the question of overconfidence, this person writes, I find myself sometimes have the opposite problem of overconfidence. I have low self-esteem. I become too open-minded and lose the stand of myself. What should I do using Vipassana?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because, of course, it's true that humankind as groups become overconfident. People know that their political view is right, the other political view is wrong. People know their religion is right, the other religion is wrong. But as individuals, everyone also has self-doubts. You'd have to be a complete uh, maniac not to notice that you don't know things and are insecure about things. And those self-doubts, ironically, are very productive internal psychological material for the Vipassana meditator. Two things can happen. Sometimes our self-doubts are eased away, are clarified, are soothed by Vipassana practice that helps us to understand it's not our business to know the answer to everything. We don't have to pretend to be experts in everything. We can say, I don't know about that. I haven't come to an answer about that. I don't really know where I'm heading on that problem or that position, and make a public or self-confessional ease and comfort with the position of self-doubt. It's not at all always a bad thing. Sometimes, however, our self-doubts are harmful to ourselves. We need to make a decision. We have to take an action. We have to know where we stand. And our self-doubts are hindrances to skillful action in the world. In the same way, Vipassana often leads us to a deeper set of tools for skillful action. Earlier in the pre-recorded section of this session, I talked about how we come up with one view. Next time we meditate, we come up with a different view. When we've had a problem for a period of time, we've meditated morning and evening over a period of time with that problem, we find out we have many, many different views, many, many different solutions on that same point. And that is a brilliant and beautiful contribution that meditation makes to our lives. Like it's putting up a spreadsheet of options from which we can more slowly, carefully, thoughtfully, skillfully choose how we're going to solve the doubt, the uncertainty, the inability to move forward that we had just a few days or a few weeks ago. So whether the self-doubt is a constructive wisdom, knowing you have limits, you don't know everything, or whether the doubt is a hindrance that may melt through Vipassana practice. In either case, Vipassana is a fine tool to keep working with when doubt is on the mind.
So here's a question. It's like a follow-up question to my spiritual bypassing question. And this person writes, I'm grateful that spiritual bypassing was addressed. In my own practice, I've experienced how Vipassana reveals the deep truth that anger harms the one who harbors it. At the same time, my understanding of trauma-informed psychology suggests that emotions like anger must often be fully felt, sometimes even expressed, to be metabolized, especially when they stem from deep wounding. This creates a tension for me. When anger arises in daily life, how do I discern whether I'm wisely observing it or unconsciously suppressing it out of fear of harming myself or others? As both a psychiatrist and meditator, how do you personally reconcile the need for emotional processing with the practice of equanimous observation?
Wonderful question. So it's not really possible to meditate in a sustained way. For example, a 10-day course, for example, twice a day, morning and evening, 1 hour sitting over a period of months, years, decades. It's not possible to do those things and suppress. Nothing makes you more aware of what you're really thinking and feeling than Vipassana. You know, if you're going to say one thing good about Vipassana, and you could say, well, it definitely makes you aware of what you're really, really thinking and feeling. And a lot of our pretensions, like, I'm so above anger, I'm such a holy, saintly person, I never get angry, that's going to be blown apart pretty fast by your own personal Vipassana practice. So Goenkaji's teaching on that is very clear. We shouldn't become pretentious, artificial, self-hindering, self-suppressive people. We should be simple, honest, real. And in our interactions with other people, that's very important to be casually confessing to the reality of who we are, not compulsively revealing our weaknesses, but just authentically engaging people with our absence of attainments as well as our attainments. So no suppression is a key part of the path. The second feature of that very good question is when and how do you express these things? When and how are you aware of them in your mind through your meditation or through your personal insight, but you don't express them? So that goes to the question of right speech, and that's why I gave so much emphasis to right speech. What will the impact of your expressions be upon you and upon those you're engaging? Will it be constructive or non-constructive? Another important point there that the question implied but didn't state is the distinction between anger and rage, a critical distinction so often lost in our heated moments. Rage is a feeling of wanting to win, conquer, destroy, eviscerate, silence, dominate over somebody or something else. Rage is never a constructive event. It always harms somebody else. That's its intention. And by harming somebody else, it harms you, who've now put yourself in a position to be hurtful and damaging. That's very different than anger. Anger can be highly constructive and well-intended. For example, very common examples, parents and children. children, parents, spouses, people who live closely together and who are very caring and loving towards each other will experience, not might experience, will experience anger towards their most chosen intimate people. And there's room to express this, neither suppress it nor use it to damage, but to speak forthrightly in a challenging and difficult way, in a manner that's intended and may well produce positive results. So for that person, uh, trying to discern the proper roles of anger in their life, the questions are, what is the origin and source of that anger? How can it be used in social interactions in a manner that's truly constructive and not damaging? When is it not actually anger at all? It's vituperation and rage.
So, connected to that question, a friend of mine um, had asked me a similar question, and he said, during the course that he did a course a long time ago, and when he did the course, he was crying, and so the AT gave him the advice, okay, keep crying, but be aware of your breathing or your sensations, and you let the tears flow. Which he was happy to hear that. So he didn't feel bad about it. But then he also had the experience of where he had a lot of anger, pent up anger come up, and he just wanted to shout. And so he asked the teacher, could he just go in the forest and let out his anger, like just shout? And the teacher said, well, no, better not do that, most likely because he'd be disturbing others. Um, and so so just a follow up, what would you say about that kind of anger? So we allow, students are told that they can allow the tears to flow as long as they're with anicca. Can somebody go off into a place and shout in the woods if they're with anicca at the same time?
Well,
What would you say to that?
I have some inconsistent answer to that. Generally, shouting in the woods is not something we would encourage at a Vipassana course. You say the other people won't hear. You say it'll be in private, but who knows? So disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the course is not conducive to having courses. It's not conducive to one's own well-being, the well-being of others around you. It's not something we would encourage. But I had an event happen. Probably this would be in the late 1980s or early 1990s. I had a good compatriot of mine on the path who got very angry. He was sitting, of course. I was conducting this course as an AT at that time, and he got very angry. And without asking anybody, without taking my permission, he got up and went to the woods. This was at Damodara, Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. It is surrounded by a lot of woods. And he went off into the woods and was screaming, and people did hear him. He did disrupt the quality of the course. Anyway, he felt he got out something very important to him. And he kept giving me unwanted and inappropriate credit for conducting a course, which he was able to overcome this anger that had been so deep seated in him that he hadn't been able to acknowledge before, that Vipassana brought to the surface, and that he decanted by yelling into the woods. So there may be two sides to the story, but it's not a practice we can recommend.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Um, it's along similar lines around suppression, and this person asks, can you elaborate sexual misconduct in Shila? Being a householder, should the relationship with one's spouse be like a brother or sister? Is my interpretation incorrect?
Yes, it's incorrect. Goenkaji really made history by bringing Vipassana out into the worldwide lay community. If we look back at the Pali Canon, it's very explicitly clear that married couples practice Vipassana. It says that, and there are a number of discourses about that. But those discourses are very few. The descriptions of the practices of these married couples is non-existent. The statement that they're there is all you get from the ancient texts. And so a worldwide community of hundreds of thousands or millions of people meditating seriously in Vipassana and being married, as we now have, hundreds of thousands to millions. It's a new phenomenon in the world. And the way that Goenkaji founded this for us was to make it clear that Vipassana does not require celibacy as a starting point or even a midpoint. So a married couple should pursue what feels right to them. And what feels right to them is a matter of multiple things. One thing is each person meditating. Two people meditating is very different than one person meditating and imposing something. So both people should be meditating. Next thing is there should be some zones of honest communication so that people know what the other people are thinking. It may be possible that you are doing something that you feel is right and that is actually harming the person you live with. It's imposing, or it's not listening, or it's demanding a special higher authority for yourself in the marriage. So this tricky art, but highly attainable art, of finding the right kind of sexual behavior for married people is one of the arts of Vipassana. It's one of the new features of Vipassana that Goenkaji made available to so many people. And like everything else I've said today, it's a changing situation between that couple, not a rule, not even a guideline, but an ongoing relationship conversation that will morph one way or another with time. And if it's carried out skillfully, can be to the benefit of both members, both people having the opportunity to feel what they feel and to help someone else live their life in Dhamma also.
There was a follow-up question that I received related to the anger question. Would it be advisable for somebody to shout if they're not on a course, like if they're in the privacy of their own home or somewhere in the woods where there aren't any other people?
Generally, our path in Dhamma is long. Goenkaji used to repeat the phrase millions upon millions of lifetimes, whatever that is. So it's not going to be one action, one application of one technique at one moment, one good action, one failed action. That's not going to be what sets the path for us. What sets the path for us is continuity, constant trying to live this way, using meditation as our guide, using the triple gem, our community, our personal practice, the teaching of the Buddha as our guide. And so there's not really a right answer to that. I would say if I heard that somebody was meditating in their house and became aware of some anger and yelled, I can't imagine any big problem with that. If someone did not yell in their house at that moment, and so you could say suppress that anger, I can't imagine any big problem with that. So I would say to that person, just keep meditating and see what happens with that anger. Don't worry about a big mistake or a little mistake in one moment. The outcome will be determined over time. And if you are meditating consistently over time, I would say it's very hard for me to imagine that anger won't fade from your life and get solved, lessened, muted, ameliorated to some degree by your Vipassana.
Right. So there's a couple of questions around metta. I sometimes like to devote more attention to the practice of metta than vipassana, as it helps calm my mind and strengthen my concentration and open my heart. Is this okay?
Well, it's hard to think of anything wrong with practicing metta. It's got to be, I think of it, personally, I think of it as my dessert. If I've eaten my meal, I get my dessert. I'm not going to be one of these naughty kids who takes the dessert without eating the meal. So what that means is that if a person said, well, look, I'm a metta freak and I'm just going to go on practicing metta, it's a good thing. Well, the Buddha recommended it very strongly. Goenkaji says it's the measure of our progress, so I'm just going to keep doing it. I think that would be a very big error because you'd lose the very Vipassana that's to guide you, that's to clarify your metta, that's to increase your metta, that's to show you the right direction for your metta to grow in. Vipassana is the education. It's the university. Um, some people go to a real university. I did. That was very important. But Vipassana is our inner, lifelong university. And please don't lose that. And just assume that what makes you feel good immediately is the practice, because there's so many things going on in us, so many situations to face, so many challenges to our feeling of metta. We need to keep refreshing ourselves in the real well of Vipassana. But as for practicing metta in an extended period after your Vipassana practice, can't think of anything more lovely.
Mhm. Thank you. Uh, Somebody asks here, can metta be shared via social media?
Well, all interactions have some potential for metta. Sometimes even nasty ones have potential for us to try to practice our metta in confrontation with a circumstance that's making us feel also peeved or angry. So metta is one way of dealing with asymmetrical and difficult. And metta is also a way of dealing with any interaction, including on the internet. But I wouldn't substitute the electronic engagement we get from the internet. I wouldn't substitute that for the actual feelings in your own heart. Those are rather different things. And so the real practice of metta comes from practicing vipassana and finding that metta stirring up in you. It's not just the moments you express it, it's the moments when it rises up in you. And that's not going to happen on the internet. That's going to happen from your vipassana practice.
Mhm. Well, there's a bunch of questions, but I think we'll just ask a couple more. What to do if one finds it really difficult to remain equanimous during meditation? Should we stop that meditation session?
Yeah, well, probably the single most misunderstood feature of a 10-day course is the sitting of strong determination. At the end of the course, Goenkaji does explicitly say, when you go home, do not practice sittings of strong determination. And everyone somehow doesn't hear that. I know for myself, I've got this tremendous drive to sit as sitting of strong determination at home every time. Goenkaji explicitly told me not to have that, and decades later I still have that. It's somehow being the good boy, doing what I'm supposed to do, practicing correctly, showing I'm strong enough to get through. And that's really not what Goenkaji encouraged us. So if it's necessary for you to disrupt that hour, for example, changing your posture, getting up, looking around, opening your eyes, that's not against our practice. In fact, that's what Goenkaji advised. However, we do feel and wish for ourselves that in the long term, over the years, the lifetime of our practice, that will happen less and less and less often. And we'll be able to more and more take that sitting not with strong determination, but just take that sitting moment by moment and not having to disrupt it in any way. So there's a goal there, but whatever happens to you, as we'll discuss in some of the sessions coming up and related to this book, whatever happens to you when you're meditating at home, your twice daily sitting, the most important thing is not to condemn it, not to judge it, not to use it to harm yourself, not to use it to put yourself down and say, oh, I couldn't complete the sitting without moving, or oh, I couldn't complete the sitting without opening my eyes and thinking that how angry I am. As it's happening, if you're practicing Vipassana, that's okay. That's something that's coming on the surface. It's happening to you now. It won't keep happening to you forever. So let it happen now and then try to go back to your Vipassana and move on. So if you have to disrupt that sitting, that's not a crime. You've harmed nobody. Don't worry about it. Just go back to Vipassana practice as soon as you can.
Mhm. I'm wondering if the person meant, can they stop meditating and just get up and move on with their day?
Well, that would not be our advised practice, but if it's essential, I'd say the same thing. I wouldn't wish to see anybody wasting their time with self-condemnation that derives from their Vipassana life. I would prefer people to understand this thing happened. It wasn't the greatest thing. I wasn't living up to the highest direction. Well, I'm not a Sama Sambuddha yet. So naturally, I've got these flaws, problems, difficulties. This one came up today. Well, let's hope tomorrow it won't come up. But even if it comes up every time I sit for a year, there's still another year ahead of me. The long goal, the long path, the path that develops in our life gives room for the lifetime practice to heal, correct, guide the problems that we now face every day. I was going to say a little humorous part of this is as you get older, all people, male, female, bladders get smaller. And sometimes those of us who are a little bit matured find that just before that 60-minute sitting is over, they better leap up and end the sitting. And so take no negativity out of that.
Hmm. In line with humor and right speech, this person asks, how can humor be a part of right speech? Very often it can meant to be in a good or fun way, but it might be completely misunderstood.
Yeah, good point. Humor is not an actual entity. There's many things that go into humor. And one of the things that's considered humor, particularly on our digital media today, is sarcasm, mockery, derision, actually cruelty, domination, and insult are mis-excused as humor. They are excused and they shouldn't be excused. And the excuse is, oh, that was just humor. I was just joking around. But actually, what you're doing is attacking, assaulting, humiliating, harming somebody else. Yeah, that's not humor. And that's not an intentional goal of the path for sure. But uh, I just came upon a beautiful expression. It's from Mark Twain. And he said, um, laughter never comes from happiness. It always comes from sorrow. And there's no laughter in heaven. Of course, for Mark Twain, heaven was a fantasy. There was no heaven, but a place where you weren't in touch with your own sorrow and suffering wouldn't generate laughter. It would just generate smugness. I think Goenkaji's 10-day discourses are a beautiful example of that. The topic at hand is this shocking, constant reminder that you're suffering and you want to come out of suffering. It's not the funnest course you could take. And yet, was there a speaker with more commanding and infectious humor than Goenkaji? So there's plenty of room for humor on the path when it's generated by our common foibles in attempting to overcome our common human weaknesses.
Great. Well, I think that is a nice place to end for this session, Q&A session. Thanks a lot, Paul. That was really great. It was a nice talk and Q&A session. And yeah, we look forward to the next session on the neurobiological dimensions of Vipassana, which will be on May 25th, I believe. So thank you for doing this and
Thank you, Kory.
sharing your knowledge
Thank you.
and experience.
Thank you so much, Paul and Kory, for joining us today. On behalf of Pariyatti, I'd like to thank you all for attending this event.
Bye, everybody.